Hello and welcome. I am Shushai Adane, and you are watching Arma Media. Today, I am honored to host Professor Kjetil Tronvoll, a leading Norwegian scholar of peace, conflict, and human rights in the Horn of Africa. With over 30 years of field work across Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the Horn, Professor Tronvoll is renowned for his deep insight into the region's politics and has also authored key works such as war and the politics of identity in Ethiopia and the African garrison state. It is truly a pleasure to see you once again. I think it has been more than 5 years since our last interview, which I think was uh, on November 2020, just after the genocidal war on Tigray broke out, and only a few days before Makala fell under control. I think you remember this, right, Professor?
Yes, I do, and thank you so much for inviting me back, Shushan.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed once again. Just to start with, uh, if you were to speak to the international community, how would you describe the true nature and magnitude of the atrocities committed against the people of Tigray during those 8 months of the genocidal war? Start with this more general question is important. Yes.
I think the international community knows very well what happened during those 2 years of war on Tigray from 2020 to 2022. There has been several reports, investigative reports, analytical reports, legal reports on the war and atrocities committed on the Tigrayan people, both from the UN system, from the AU system, from EU, from international NGOs and academics. So if the international system wants to know, there are ample evidence and analytical reporting on it. From my point of view, the warfare, as I have commented on earlier, the way it was conducted, the lack of distinction between civilians and combatants, the proportionality of the warfare, the reasoning stated by officials from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, both politicians and military, um, and the way the widespread conduct of the warfare against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Tigray, it certainly amounts to crimes against humanity on several accounts. But overall, I think if it had been a legal process in a court of law, international or national for that matter, I think it should have been under the Genocide Convention.
One more general question before we turn to the specific questions that brought us here today. How would you characterize the present condition of Tigray in terms of governance, humanitarian realities, and the broader political trajectory it faces now?
Well, I have to be a bit careful. I haven't been in Tigray this year. I was there last year, traveling across the region. So I'm not updated personally. Of course, I read on whatever is published, and I have good contact with friends and colleagues on the ground, so to say, in Tigray. I think to focus on the political security dimension, I think it is a very precarious situation you are in today, in the sense of both political authority, how it is constituted, how it is wielded, how it is connected to the broader constituency of Tigrayans, and how it is its relationship to Addis Ababa and other international partners. I put a question mark behind much of the conduct of politics, so to say, in Tigray today, due to a variety of factors. I think we will enter into that a bit later. All of this is augmented by the precarious security context. both in terms of perceived or real threats emanating from outside forces, but also, as we see within Tigray, at least what is reported by individuals and organizations, the increasing threat towards civilian safety and welfare committed by local actors, be that regional state or federal or non-state actors in the region. And of course, it is again strengthened these both the precarious political situation and the increasing negative trend of security and safety for Tigrayans is strengthened by the humanitarian context and conditions, which are dire, particularly among the IDPs, obviously, but also in the population at large, as we see it. So it is a very negative trend, if I can use that term, we do see in Tigray over the last, since more or less signed the Pretoria Agreement.
You said from all sides, right? So based on your personal observation or assessment whatsoever it may be, who do you think bears the greatest responsibility for that situation? Is it Isaias Afwerki, Abiy Ahmed, TPLF leadership, or do they all share it in different proportions?
I think what you said, the latter part of your question might be the correct one. I'm not the one to dish out blame to any of the parties, but we do see the responsibility might be vested in all you mentioned. Primarily, the situation in Tigray is, of course, the responsibility by constitution or by law for the regional administration of Tigray, the interim government of Tigray. They are vested with authority to administer and run the state under the federal government. So the first level of responsibility rests with the interim government. But obviously the interim government, as we know, is totally reliant upon the TPLF party in how to process politics and administration in the region. So that means that the TPLF party is equally responsible, or is the responsible body, so to say, on how politics is unfolding in Tigray, although there is on paper a separation of power between the interim government and the party, but in practice there might be difficulties today to see that separation. It was more easier, obviously, during the Getachew Reda tenure, when it was an increasing power struggle between the interim administration and the party. Today, it is more blurred, that distinction. But a lot of, the operating procedures, the funding, the framework of politics in Tigray is delegated by the federal authorities, or defined by the federal authorities, or restricted by the federal authorities under the Pretoria Agreement, but also under the rules and laws and constitutional framework as the interim government is established on or in according to. So the federal government obviously also holds a lot of the responsibility for the lack of full implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, for the humanitarian situation in Tigray, and also for whatever instability Tigray might have on its borders to Amhara regional state, to Afar, and to Eritrea, the international border. But that's the domestic scene and actors in Ethiopia. But again, Ethiopia has always been threatened or challenged by its neighbors, be that a bit faraway neighbors as Egypt or its closest neighbor, Eritrea. And Isaias Afwerki has a very specific agenda of destabilizing Ethiopia that is very well known. It's not hidden. It has been articulated from Isaias and Asmara for 30 years. So that is also directly felt in Tigray, obviously, in terms of what's happening now with the Ximdo and other political processes. So yes, the responsibility is, I don't know if I will say equally shared among the political elites, but at least it is shared among the political elites in Ethiopia and beyond.
Thank you. In one of your recent interviews, you described TPLF as being at the center of the crisis of the Tigrayan people. So, from your long engagement with the party's history and the leadership, how do you interpret its actions and choices since the war? Of course, this question is almost related to the previous one.
It's that's actually a very complicated question because it can be unpacked and approached from different angles. Yeah, I think if we, and as an observer, external observer, as a researcher, as an analyst on what's happening, you should always, and certainly as an anthropologist, you should always try to put yourself in the place of the people or the context you study. So if I can view it as I see it from the TPLF leadership side, I think they are struggling to cope with the dramatic changes which are happening in the region. They are struggling to understand the new political dynamics among Tigrayans, particularly the younger generation of Tigrayans, the intellectuals. They are struggling to find a new path ideologically, possibly, or to reinforce the old ideology on the new generations. And they are possibly aware that they are losing it. They're losing it. They're losing the rapport with the broader Tigrayan constituency. And that makes them frustrated, desperate, call it whatever you want. And then you get the kind of instinct politics. In certain tradition is called path dependency, in a theory that, we use the old models, the old procedures, because they were successful earlier on the current situation. I don't think necessarily that is the good way to do it. And hence we do see that they are more and more restricting the space of alternative voices in Tigray. For instance, the comment on media, which Mojorno made some weeks back, that should be restricted, which is, in my view, a sign of increasing insecurity on how they rule and insecurity on their relationship to their constituency. That insecurity might be well placed, so to say, not only because of their own policies and perception, but because of the outside threat they feel also, which is very relevant. And I think we need to factor that in, the increasing desperation, not only among the Tigrayan people, but in the leadership level too, on what's happening with Tigray, where should we go from now? What's our overall objective with the struggle we are under today, and how to reach that objective? If that objective is independent Republic of Tigray, which was articulated during the war, or if it is a harmonious, peaceful relationship within Ethiopia, or if it is some other kind of relationship with Eritrea, then, as Ximdo is exemplifying. That very contested terrain the Tigrayan leadership needs to maneuver in, I sympathize with that. Also because the willingness, or at least the apparent willingness from the federal government to fully include Tigray, to fully include the interim government into mainstream politics in Ethiopia, is under question. Best exemplified with the rejection of a re-registration of TPLF as a political entity, as a legal political entity in Ethiopia. So they are kind of, they have both painted themselves into a corner and they have been pushed into a corner by the external pressure they are under. And that's what makes me a bit nervous, because when an organization and when an actor as TPLF is pushed into a corner, you can get some desperate strategies to get out of that corner. Because TPLF is also an organization of survival. And we know their operational skills, we know their ideological baggage, and hence, and we know Ethiopian political culture, so to say, which TPLF has skillfully maneuvered in, as Isaias, as Abiy Ahmed for that matter, which makes this a very precarious context we are under today.
Thank you very much indeed. But in relation to the issue that we raised and discussed now, if granted the opportunity to connect with the party's leadership, what guidance would you offer, and why do you consider it necessary, Professor?
Again, I don't think I should give any guidance to either TPLF or the federal government for that matter. I think they have their own agency. Through my writings for the last 30 or so years, I have offered criticism to TPLF and EPRDF based on how I assess the political development, and I really think that speaks for itself, so to say, that they need to, I don't want to be taken into account for any kind of position arguing for or against any political actor. What all political actors in Ethiopia should strive is obviously to find some negotiated solutions to the predicament they are under, be that at the regional or federal or Horn of Africa level. I don't necessarily think that will happen. That's a realist analytical position I do have. It is not a normative position. Obviously, normatively, I favor peaceful talks and negotiations. A realist understanding is something else, because often those talks have failed, or they haven't produced a sustainable, durable, peaceful solution to the issues at hand. And the issues at hand are so substantial in Tigray and in Ethiopia and in the Horn. So I don't necessarily think it is possible to find a peaceful solution to it. There is one way of framing this, which goes way beyond TPLF, is to understand what we see today out of empire theory. Either a disintegration of the empire or a reconsolidation of the empire. You can have both approaches to it, understanding Ethiopia today. But that creates tensions at all levels of state, from the local administration to the regional state to the federal to the Horn of Africa level. And that's what makes it so complicated. And in this situation, actors try to maneuver the best they can in order to survive, primarily, not necessarily in order to represent their constituency. And I think that's a dilemma we do see in Tigray today. I do put question mark who is representing the Tigrayan majority constituency today politically. I don't know. It might be TPLF, it might be something else. We don't know. We do see a lot of resistance against the current TPLF policy from Tigrayans of all walks of life, in my view. But we don't know what alternatives they favor, because it is not an open plural context to either to undertake opinion polls or, for that matter, an election. So I'm just hesitant to pass any judgment on it, but I do see it is a genuine challenge, and I don't think coming from a liberal tradition and being a liberal by inclination, I don't think monopolizing power is the way to go. And I think the party leadership is falling back into some old traditions which they should break out of instead of reproducing.
You earlier said TPLF is a party of survival, right? And now you, on the contrary, said by now you are hesitant that there are quite a lot of resistances, right, here and there against TPLF. So, do you think TPLF would survive just like the previous times, or as compared to its history?
Oh yes, I think it is way too early to pass the death sentences on TPLF. Certainly so. I think they will survive, but I hope they will reinvent themselves into a different framing. If they don't do that, they will increasingly meet challenges, but they still might survive. I think TPLF still holds a support base in the rural areas of Tigray, which is traditional, which is normal, so to say, in these kind of contexts. That is the backbone of Tigray still, the rural Tigray. But they need to find means to communicate, as I said, to a new generation of Tigrayans, and need to find means to present their policies as an alternative to a more liberal ideas. Because I do think Tigrayan intellectuals, Tigrayan urbanized young Tigrayans, and increasingly also rural Tigrayans, first of all, they want peace, obviously. They want peace, stability for their family, for their children. But they also want to choose themselves. The vanguardism of TPLF, I think, is the biggest threat both to themselves and to the Tigrayan constituency. That there are a certain core in the leadership which still believes that their thinking, their ideology gives them the entitlement to decide on behalf of everyone else. And I don't think that should be the politics anymore. So the vanguardism ideology needs to be replaced with a more open, liberal understanding on how politics should be organized.
Good. What are your observations, Professor, on the internal split within TPLF? Is this an ideological disagreement or power struggle or generational divide?
Again, I think it can be analyzed from all those three viewpoints, and more possibly also the parochial identity dimensions is also playing into some part of that fragmentation. And I must say that I'm a bit surprised that we have seen that kind of fragmentation of the Tigrayan constituency, or should I say the TPLF constituency, with the we can almost characterize it as a split when Getachew Reda and his group left the party and established Simret. It is not only individual defections, there were many prominent individuals surrounding Getachew and the interim administration which left. And you have also had Tigrayan generals leaving the party, so to say. So and organizing themselves under a new entity as Simret, and also the Tigray Peace Forces, which is a bit surprising. If you remember back in 2001, the split of TPLF at that time, where, yes, some key individuals in the party leaving, but they didn't establish an alternative, so to say. They left as individuals and kind of remained as individuals opposing the TPLF. This time there is a momentum to establish an alternative to TPLF, a Tigrayan alternative to TPLF at the high level, which is very interesting to follow. and a bit of surprise, I must say, when you think of the people, how staunch TPLF leaders they were, both prior to the war and during the war, and then suddenly they reject that baggage and start something new. So I lost control of your original question here. I hope I'm not meandering too far out. And I think that it opens up a new dimension, a new dynamic of Tigrayan politics. What we do see, for good and bad. For good and bad. The bad thing, obviously, is a disintegration, fragmentation, creating unrest and possibly security concerns with, as I said, the new armed groups of Tigray peace forces, Harar Meret, but also which can jeopardize the stability of Tigray development. But it's also positive in the sense that pluralism should come to Tigrayan constituency. The Tigrayan people, electorate, should have the opportunity to choose freely among several competing parties and candidates and different visions and different ideologies for the future. So in that way, it is positive, I do think, if it is catered for within a peaceful context and environment. We have to see. The elections will be next year in Ethiopia in the spring of 2026. If it will be an election in Tigray, I'm not so sure, but we have to wait and see. And if it is an election, I'm not so sure if it will be free and open.
Do you think Simrat would be allowed to take part in the election in Tigray?
Well, I would rather turn the question around. Will TPLF be allowed to take part in that election? Because that election will be organized by the National Election Board. And Simret is a legally registered party in Ethiopia. TPLF is not. So that's what I'm pointing at, in the sense that as long as TPLF is there and running the show in Tigray, and if they are not allowed to participate as a legal registered party, it will not be an election in Tigray because they have the control.
Okay, if you were to single out one major initiative produced by Getachew Reda that has now been abandoned or undermined by TPLF under General Tadesse Reda's administration, what would it be? And what does that tell us about the political power balance and the decision-making culture within Tigray today?
I'm not quite sure if I fully grasped the content of your question, but I think the initiative which...
Let me repeat it. Yeah. If you were to single out one major initiative introduced by Getachew Reda that has now been abandoned or undermined by TPLF under General Tadesse Reda's administration, what would it be, and what does that tell us about the political power balance and decision-making culture within Tigray today? Yeah, that's the question.
I think the interim government under Getachew Reda had many challenges to operate and to implement the Pretoria Agreement, which was not necessarily the responsibility of TPLF, so to say. It was more the responsibility of the federal government. But I think what really undermined the power and authority of the interim government under Getachew Reda was his interest to separate the party and government, to separate the party and local administration in particular. That was understood as a direct threat to the dominance and control of TPLF of the Tigrayan constituency. So I think that contributed more to the fall of Getachew than other elements in the Pretoria Agreement, for instance, because separation of the party and the state was not part of the Pretoria Agreement. That's an internal affair of Tigray, so to say. And Getachew's interest, apparently, to establish a more systems of checks and balances and a more accountable administration under his authority, which failed. And And I don't see that initiative being sustained by Tigray Reda's administration, the separation of the party and government in Tigray. Rather the opposite, you see more of a conflation of that, or at least it has been not prioritized, so to say. But it might be that you have that there are things working in the shadows which I don't see from where I sit, so to say. I remember at least some colleagues and friends discussed it when Alem was taken into the regional administration by Tadesse. What would that imply in terms of control of local government by the regional administration versus the party? As you know, he is instrumental in controlling that cadre networks at the local level. I haven't seen how that has been pushed by the interim government after Alem joined them. But yeah, it will be interesting to follow. But I think that is one of the key issues which not have been addressed directly by Tadesse. I think, Tigray Reda's interim government is struggling with the exact same issues that Getachew Reda's interim government were struggling with. The return of IDPs, the control of territories, safeguarding the borders of Tigray, humanitarian challenges, development challenges, budgetary challenges, and so on and so forth. So there are the same restrictions on how politics operates today than as it was under Getachew Reda. But we do see that as under Getachew, the communication, at least in public, between Mekele and Addis was more amicable, more peaceful, more friendly, where we do see today an increasing questioning and increasing maybe hostile rhetoric between Mekele and Addis, which is very worrying. So it is somehow a realignment of how the interim government operates, that it relates more to local elites in Tigray, meaning the party, than it relates to the federal level and the federal government.
What you earlier said is what the majority of this new generation, yes, considers as something which is now abandoned, which has been already introduced by Getachew Reda, which is red line or zero tolerance in relation to media narrative in Tigray, right? Or in other words, with regard to controlling the media narrative. Is this observation true? Do you share that with the new generation now claiming that should be back, yes, to Tadesse Reda's administration?
Well, you have to tell me that. You know that better than I, if it is true, so to say. You are there.
No. It was already raised by you, in our first...
Well, I saw the statements and I saw the concern by media operators and intellectuals that this obviously is a huge step back in terms of liberalization of the Tigrayan political space, and again a classic sign that any political actor with ambition to sustain its power needs to crack down on alternative voices criticizing that power. So to try to restrict media freedom, to try to restrict alternative voices is of course a worrying sign in this regard. If that was the intention behind that statement by Mongiorno, as far as I saw.
Okay. Looking back at the course of events, what do you think would have happened to Tigray if its leadership had chosen to align with Abiy Ahmed's political agenda from the very beginning, as most other regions did, considering the enormous human and material cost Tigray has paid. Tigray has paid, and the ongoing multifaceted crisis. Would early submission have prevented the region's devastation, or merely led to the gradual erosion of its political identity and autonomy under Abiy's centralized rule?
Well, that's contrafacting a question which is difficult to give a concrete answer to. Obviously, there's just speculations. But if when the call to abandon EPRDF and to establish Prosperity Party was made in December 2019, just after Abiy returned from Oslo and the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, the alternative for TPLF would have been, if they should join the Prosperity Party, meaning closing down the TPLF party, so to say, and the history of the struggle and all the symbolic and historical elements contained in both in TPLF as such, in Woyane, in the 17 years of struggle, that would have, I don't think that would ever have been accepted, no matter what the other alternative was. The only way I could see that happening is if the old guard and the leadership said, well, we are at the crossroads. We see that there is something else now, a new vision of Ethiopia. We don't necessarily agree with that vision, but we don't want to stand in the way to jeopardize or to risk to jeopardize the peace in Tigray. So we all step down from the party leadership role. And then kind of giving that question then back to the Tigrayan constituency, saying that, it is up to you. Let's have a referendum in Tigray. What should we do? Should we close down TPLF and accept Prosperity Party as our government and to be more fully integrated into Ethiopia or not? That could have been an alternative because it was such a fundamental crossroads, not only for Ethiopia, but for Tigray itself, more so for Tigray, as we saw the consequences of they pulling back. So it was a totally, naive to believe, as I talked to other international diplomats and so on, they said, oh, no, they will join Prosperity Party. They said, no, that's hopeless. They will never do that. And it was very clear from the early statements that they will never do that. And the way Abiy came to power also was an indication of that. So I don't think, the only alternative would be that, to put it up for referendum in Tigray. That I could have seen as an alternative. Had Ethiopia had a traditional referendum, so to say, well, you have had one, and we saw what happened with that on Eritrea. But you don't have that tradition, and so it was inevitable what happened.
Okay. A bit similar question, or a question which is a bit related to that. If Tigray decides to pursue full independence, what forms of resistance or pressure might it face from internal divisions, from neighboring states, including Ethiopia, Eritrea, and from the international community, which often prioritizes regional stability over self-determination?
Well, I were discussing these issues with Debretsion and the party leadership, both during the war and immediate after, when the objective of the struggle were to, where the stated public objective of the struggle were to push back the dominance of Addis Ababa over Tigray and to have a referendum on independence immediately after the warring was over. And anchored within the Ethiopian constitution, because that allows for that to happen, constitutional. But then, of course, you need a compliant government at the federal level, accepting, handling, facilitating a regional state referendum on independence or not, under Article 47. But so it needs consent at both levels of the state for that article, for the constitution to be implemented on that issue. We know that the Ogadennians tried early in the 1990s to organize a referendum on independence for Somali region, which was brutally crushed by TPLF EPRDF because they were not interested in that. So it doesn't, you know, it is not, EPRDF, TPLF held the same opinion.
Professor, sorry for the interruption. Would you please start from what you said? I mean, when PRD4 was in power in Addis, soon as you said that there was an interruption or a disconnection of internet. So
when TPLF EPRDF was in power themselves, they held the understanding that the constitutional article of succession should not be accepted, so to say, as default mechanism. The Ogadennian front, the Somali front, tried to facilitate and argued the regional government of Somali regional state, argued to facilitate a referendum in the mid-1990s on these issues, which was brutally crushed by EPRDF, TPLF in power. So, you know, it's nothing new today, so to say. and I don't think any politician is born who would voluntarily see that his power base, his country, his territory, demographics are voluntarily letting go of, like in a peaceful process of referendum in Tigray or in Somali regional state or in Gambela or whoever for that matter. I don't think that will happen by consent. It needs to be a pressure, and I guess that was one of the rationale from the war, from the Tigrayan viewpoint, to put pressure on Addis Ababa also to accept then a possible referendum on independence for Tigray. But that will, if in an ideal world, Addis consent to a referendum on independence, then the international community are forced to accept that, because then you follow the procedure of the Ethiopian constitution, and the international community cannot criticize that. And I guess if Addis says, yes, you're welcome to have a referendum, if you vote yes, you are free to go to establish an independent Republic of Tigray. And then Rump Ethiopia will be the first state to recognize sovereignty for Tigray, as Ethiopia was the first state to recognize sovereignty of Eritrea in 1993, then other internationals will follow. That is a theoretical, hypothetical scenario. I don't think it will happen. So what are the other alternatives for Tigray? Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you interpret Ethiopia under empire theory, it is still the borders of statehood in Tigray, in the Horn of Africa, is still not permanently settled. You will have a reconfiguration of international borders in the Horn of Africa. I believe so. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in 30 years or 20 years or whatever. And in that regard, if the authority of Addis Ababa is so weak that they don't control the territory of Ethiopia, well, they don't control the territory of Ethiopia today, we know that, when the Fano insurgency, the OLA, Tigray, and so on, that Tigray might seek alternative solutions. And the only alternative solution in that regard is somehow linked to Eritrea. Because Eritrea is a sovereign state. And you can have Tigray disassociating from Ethiopia and linking itself to Eritrea, and kind of piggybacking on Eritrean sovereignty. which is somehow a plausible scenario as we see the latest movements with Ximdo and other issues in the region today. But it doesn't give Tigray sovereignty, but it gives Tigray an outlet, so to say, an ease. It doesn't leave it isolated as Somaliland, for instance, which still haven't obtained international recognition, although Somaliland is the best functioning democratic state in the Horn of Africa for the last 25, 30 years. It's a paradox. Mogadishu, Somalia, doesn't have any internal sovereignty, meaning that the government of Mogadishu, of Somalia, have the capacity to control security, the monopoly of power, of violence, tax collection, infrastructure, and so on. They don't even control the capital. They hardly control the palace compound. Somalia only has external sovereignty bestowed upon them by the international system and international states, which is a paradox. So Tigray is in a predicament. If you want to seek independence, you have very few options. You have nowhere to go, so to say, but either to negotiate a deal, acceptance with others, which is doubtful, or maybe not. Maybe possible. I don't know. But I don't think so. Or seek some alternative with Eritrea. But then, if you go for that, you will have a constant conflict with others, because others will not accept that. So you will have a constant border war, so to say, on your southern borders versus the rest of Ethiopia. So as the situation is today, I think that is a non-feasible strategy vision. And that might be sad in the eyes of many Tigrayans, I know, but I think realistically, it is rather hopeless.
Okay. Considering the deep-rooted and the multi-dimensional crisis you are already mentioning right now on the ground in Tigray, where do you think Tigray is heading today? In simple terms, what is it? What is its future prospect, Professor?
That's difficult to say. And are you heading anywhere, or are you standing still? To turn it around.
Okay.
And that's the problem, because if you stand still, you are weakened day by day. You are slowly kind of disintegrating. Your people are starving, dying, and you don't manage to develop and come out of this trap you are in. So you need to head somewhere, as you say, but most of those avenues of peaceful development are possibly closed or are very restricted. Or if you don't, again, hypothetically speaking, because there are no answers to your questions, so to say. There are no easy answers to your questions. There are just a lot of possible or likely or less likely scenarios we can talk about. I remember discussing at the very start of the war with the Tigrayan diaspora on some online platform. Was it Tegat, or I don't remember exactly, a diaspora group, where we discussed. This was just after the federal intervention on Tigray and the start of the war, just a couple of weeks. I think it was even before Mekele fell. No, it was after Mekele had fallen. Sorry, it was the end of in December or January. So where we discussed, or they asked me on what are the alternatives, and I said clearly the alternative was to lay down arms and just say that we don't want to fight. That is an alternative. We don't want to fight. We were mistaken, or just say that we don't agree with you, but we don't want to fight. So we lay down arms, and you can take control of Tigray administratively from Addis, and you decide. That is always an alternative to obey to power. In Ethiopia, on the other hand, it seldom is used because you are resisting power. You're resisting authority to a certain degree. At the same time, you have a kind of a schizophrenic relationship because you're extremely hierarchical society, traditionally, and today, extremely hierarchical. But at the same time, you're also resisting power politically. Going to the bush, being a shifta, is somehow admired politically, culturally, historically. So I was severely criticized by this group of Tigrayan scholars and diaspora activists when I said that clearly you have an alternative just to lay down arms. I said, no. How can you say that? It's not an alternative. Well, it is. And it is today too. It is a concrete alternative for Tigray and for the political leadership to say, we're closing the shop. We don't want to put our people in jeopardy anymore. We don't want to pull our people into a new war, be that with Addis or Eritrea or whoever. We see that our agency to help our people are so weakened that actually the alternative of the enemy is better for the well-being of our people. That is the dilemma you're under. And that's a terrible dilemma when you have to entertain the idea that the alternative of the enemy is better than we can give you, because we want you to survive as a people. We want you to develop as a people, and we cannot provide that. So I'm extremely happy that I'm not in the position of either Isaias Reda or Debretsion, for that matter, who have to think about this, who have to entertain those ideas, alternatives. If they are, I don't know. But they should. They should entertain that. For the betterment of the people, for the betterment of the next generation of Tigrayans, for the children of today. Is it better for them to actually succumb or to be under the authority of a political party or a political system or a political ideology, a vision, which the leadership today don't accept?
I appreciate that perspective, Professor. Let's now move to Eritrea, especially the recent development known as Sundo, you were mentioning, of course, which has drawn growing regional and international attention. As you may know, Sundo is reportedly an initiative led by President Isaias Afwerki, considering his government's direct involvement in the mass atrocities, destruction, and systematic abuses inflicted on Tigray during the war. What do you believe motivates him to launch this initiative now? What strategic or political ends may he be aiming to serve through this or through Sundo, Professor?
Well, you say it was initiated by Isaias?
Yeah.
You have proof on that?
I said reportedly.
Yeah, okay.
I said reportedly.
Yeah, okay. Accepted.
Okay.
It might well be initiated by Isaias, but we do see an initiative, and I think this is interesting. And let me take a step back or two. From 2016 to 2018, I had the privilege to work together with some excellent Tigrayan researchers, both from Mekelle University and Adigrat University, to do work on the border with Eritrea to look into people-to-people reconciliation under the stalemate, which was still effective at that time. And clearly, we saw and of course it's obvious, the interest, the need of the people at the grassroots in the frontiers, on the border, to reconnect with their friends, relatives, in-laws, family on the Eritrean side, and vice versa. And we saw the somehow increase in some petty trade across the border zone, and a gradual kind of weakening of the securitization of the border. And then you had the peace agreement between Addis and Asmara, and the opening. And I remember I was in Zalambeza in early September 2018, because the local inhabitants of Zalambeza and of
Eritrea.
of Adikaye, not Ostenafe, had initiated a reunion ceremony where they wanted to celebrate together on the border in Zalambeza. So we were expecting a huge delegation from Eritrea to come to Zalambeza to join in the celebration, because it was prepared, a big celebration, and I was there. But then, because it was a peace, it was peaceful, yeah, and Ethiopian Airlines has started to fly, I think, even to Asmara. But it was stopped by the authorities in Asmara. They denied the people of Eritrea to cross into Ethiopia. And then the week after, it was the official opening on the ground, when Prime Minister Abiy and Isaias was there, so to say. So it is instrumental. And then we saw again, that was the third week of September, it was opened. And then Isaias closed the border on the ground end of December. It was only open for 3 months, as you know, yeah? Because it is instrumental for Isaias to keep control both of his population movement, but also to keep control of the narrative of reconciliation, or the narrative of linking back to Tigray. He needs to be on top of that. Also, Addis Ababa have an interest to control the narrative of bilateral affairs, but it's a different level, because Isaias relates to Tigray. When it comes to the border between Eritrea and Tigray, it doesn't relate to Addis on that understanding of that border, dynamics of that border. And I think the interest of the political elite to control movement across the border is, of course, clear. But it's not only movement, it's so much more else in terms of cultural, historical, political baggage into this, which they also want to control. And Ximdo is kind of reflecting that. When TPLF today, in the recent statements, they say this is not an official initiative. It's just a people-to-people reconciliation. Yeah, we are not involved in it. We, as a political government, interim government, or as a party. And they reject the accusations by the federal government that this is building of a new alliance, political alliance, which will turn into a possible military alliance. So TPLF is using the narrative that this is just people-to-people reconnecting, which is obviously positive in the sense of the history of the people across Mereb. So, but it is also very clear, based on recent history and deeper history, that the political elites have always manipulated Mereb as either a zone of separation or a zone of connection, both during, pre-Italian time. We can go back to the pre-Italian time of conflicts across Mereb between the Ras of Tigray and Mereb Melash. So this is an historical dynamic which goes back several hundred years, which is now again is framed under the expression of Ximdo, which is very interesting for me to see that kind of longue durée analytical viewpoint of what's happening and how the political elite is manipulating these identities on both sides of the river. So I think from Isaias's viewpoint, this is again all about survival of himself. It's nothing about connecting people to people. It's nothing about helping Tigray. It's only about he now viewing the federal government of Ethiopia as a direct threat, not only to the territorial integrity of Eritrea, but to his power itself. And in order to stem off that perceived or plausible threat, he needs not only allies in Ethiopia, but he needs also a buffer zone. He needs a strategic depth. So the war primarily should be fought on Ethiopian soil. The war on Eritrea should primarily be fought on Ethiopian soil, not on Eritrean soil. And then Tigray...
In other words, in Tigray, you mean?
Yeah, then Tigray will be the war zone of the battle between Addis and Asmara. So we need that strategic depth. At the same time as we need the Tigrayan TDF to fight alongside him against Addis. So I guess that is what he is tempting the Tigrayan elites with, that, you know, if you stand with me now in a new war on Addis, I will give you whatever you want afterwards, in the sense of maybe you can get your independence or you can get control of whatever. That's a plausible. I don't know. I'm not saying I know that, because, you know, I see what the TPLF leadership are saying. They reject that they have any high-level discussions with Asmara. Okay, you need to apply a bit of source criticism on that statement when there are so many other indications that actually things are going on. Things are happening in terms of communication. And, you know, there were communication between TPLF, TDF generals also during the war with Eritrea and before the war, so, or before the rapprochement for that matter. So, you know, these have historical relationship. They know each other personally and so on, way back. So what it will, if it will be manifesting itself into something more concrete in the near future, I don't know. I think it is a bit too early to say, and it depends a lot on how the federal government of Ethiopia will maneuver versus Assad, access to the sea, the threat of Eritrea destabilizing Ethiopia and so on. And you see that Ethiopia is building up an argument very consciously with the latest letter from my former friend and colleague Gideon, the foreign minister of Ethiopia, to the UN Secretary General. Very well argued letter framed within international law that Eritrea is a direct threat to the security of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, and that Ethiopia is claiming the right to self-defense under international law. That basically is that letter. So, and that might, you know, I think Ethiopia has a rightful position to defend itself from incursions from Eritrea, for destabilizing a tactic in Eritrea. It is very clear accusations and indications that they are assisting Fano movement. The recent weeks' operations in Wollo by the Fano would likely not have been so successful without outside help, to use that term. So I think, again, Tigray will be squeezed in this, and I think that's what the Tigrayan authorities in Tigray today need to consider. What are we doing if we take that route with the Ximdo? How will it strengthen the protection and security of our people, or will it jeopardize it?
Whose initiative do you think is Sundo, if so, You already challenged me when I said Sundo is an initiative, yes, taken by Isaias.
Both.
Both.
Because Isaias need allies in Ethiopia, in Tigray. And as I said earlier, TPLF Tigray elites need allies to move forward, be that Addis or Asmara. Because if they stand still, you are dying. You are weakened day by day. So in order to break out of the impasse, as I understand the Tigrayan authorities, they need to break out of the current impasse. And by doing so, they need to ally with someone outside of Tigray, so that they can either go north or south. But one can argue that the interim government, at least under Getachew Reda, really tried to appease the federal government in the sense of trying to maintain a good relation with the federal government. But the federal government gave very little back to Tigray in terms of implementing all aspects of the Pretoria Agreement. So the current administration might also have tried to relate to and appease the federal government, but very soon realized, based on what happened during the first interim government and based on pressure from the party, that we will not get the full support to implement the Pretoria Agreement by Addis Ababa, and we will not get the full resources needed to rebuild Tigray, both economically and humanitarian infrastructure, you name it. So then what are our alternatives to that then? If we don't have Addis as an ally, who can be our allies? So I think Ximdo emerged as a consequence of interest both in Mekele and in Asmara. I don't think it is only one-sided. I think it is a mutual interest somehow, which are materializing in that alliance.
But you know, there were rumors on social media indicating that Isaias has already put a red line not to even think about independence. So that may not be part of the promise he might have made to the Tigrayan leadership.
That he doesn't want to accept Tigray independence, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that might well be so, but I think from both sides, if a new war breaks out, both sides will have the interest and the push for regime change in each other states. Certainly for Ethiopia, to secure access to sea and to get rid of the destabilizing regime in Asmara, which have destabilized them for 30 years, they need to change the regime in Asmara. And for Isaias to fulfill his interests with Ethiopia, weakened Ethiopia, disintegrated Ethiopia, fragmented Ethiopia, which will not be a threat to Eritrea and his vision and idea of Eritrea and the Horn, it is opportune to go for regime change in the sense of breaking down Prosperity Party and the current government. And whatever comes next, that can be either a kind of a coalition government of TPLF, Fano, OLA, which I think is highly doubtful, so to say, that they will manage to work together. But no matter what comes next, it will be chaos in Ethiopia. You will not have a strong enough central authority to threaten Eritrea. So for Isaias, he doesn't need to think beyond toppling the government. He doesn't need to think what kind of stable, new, friendly government will be in Addis. He just needs to think, let's topple these guys, because then it will be a longer period of instability in Ethiopia. Ethiopia needs to think otherwise versus Eritrea. They need to think that, post-Isaias, we need a friendly, conducive government in Eritrea, which somehow managed to hold the country together, which might be questionable, but at least which managed to, don't, which at least doesn't pose a threat in terms of collapsing government. So you have a Somalization of Eritrea, which will have a negative security spillover effect to Ethiopia. That has been the concern of TPLF EPRDF during their tenure. When I discussed it with them, high-level representatives of the EPRDF government, and said, why don't you take off Isaias? You had a chance in 2012 during the Forto mutiny coup, when he was at his weakest. And the fear was that if we killed Isaias today, Eritrea will disintegrate tomorrow. And that will have a negative security spillover effect on Ethiopia. And we are not ready to take responsibility to stabilize Eritrea. So that's somehow a dilemma also for the current government in Ethiopia, but not at the level maybe which makes them so concerned, because they might think on one hand it is opportune that Eritrea disintegrate, because then we can take the Afar seacoast, at least the Danakil and Assab, bringing that back to Ethiopia, which somehow they claim belongs to Ethiopia, at least belongs to the Afar regional state then, which again then belongs to Ethiopia. Or to prop up a friendly puppet government in Asmara, which are interested and willing to enter into long-term lease of Assab to Ethiopia and to have friendly bilateral relations and to relate to Ethiopia as a, big brother, which Isaias is not interested to do. He hates that Ethiopia is the big brother, which is default.
In your recent analysis, you explored possible future scenarios in which Tigray and Eritrea might, under certain conditions, come together, perhaps through a federation or a confederation or even a unitary arrangement, right? But you also noted that such a possibility could only arise after President Isaias Afwerki's departure. So the question is, could you please expand on that analytical prediction? What underlying political, social, or structural factors do you think could make such a scenario plausible or even attractive in a post-Isaias context, right?
Yes. I don't think I'm alone in being very concerned on what will happen with Eritrea after Isaias is gone. And, he will depart one way or another in the rather near future because he's getting old. And he has built a state on himself. There are very little structures of statehood in Eritrea, but a military elite and a military system that holds the country together, so to say. The party is not there. The parliament is non-existent. The ministries and the bureaucracy are just hollowed out with geriatric patients, so to say, at the government level. More or less all of the ministers are above the age of 80, and they're dying off one after the other. The same is the military top echelon of the generals. So and he hasn't established any kind of civil society which might, have the capacity to contribute to a peaceful transition of power after he departs. He hasn't built institutions anchored either in law or in traditional authorities. He has broken down traditional authorities to the village level also. So, and then adding to that, the very cohesive nationalism we saw in Eritrea in the early 1990s is also gone. It is a divided society because Isaias have exactly ruled on the principles of divide and rule. And I do have rather good contacts with Eritrean opposition groups of various kinds, but I also have good contacts, colleagues, friends, and I travel extensively across Eritrean lowlands, both the western lowlands and in Afar. And representatives of those communities, those 8 ethnic groups which are not represented in Isaias's formal nationalism, they have very, in my opinion, in my impression, they have very different visions and interest for a post-Isaias Eritrea than the representatives of the Highland group, Tigrinya group. And as you see, the Eritrean opposition is still, even after 30 years in exile, are still extremely fragmented and to a degree disoriented. So they don't pose a consolidated, coherent alternative to Isaias Afwerki when he departs. That's why I'm very afraid of what will happen to Eritrean statehood after he goes. And hence, the scenario or the theory of reconfiguration of statehood, also not only because of the Empire of Ethiopia, but Eritrea belongs as part of that kind of realm, but also the weakened statehood of Eritrea. That can create opportunities for some, be that the Afars to reunite as some want, or for the Tigrinya group on both sides of River Mereb to reunite, as some argue, or for the Western lowlanders in Eritrea to reunite with the brothers and sisters in Sudan, as some argue. You have different alternatives, different visions, different interests. And then you have the geopolitical play by other regional and international actors with a stake in the game when it comes to the Red Sea coast, when it comes to the ports, when it comes to control of a sphere of influence, be that Egypt, Saudi, Qatar, Emirates, Turkey, and of course Russia, US is a bit further away, but there are a lot of contenders who wants to put their imprint on post-Isaias Eritrea for one way or another. Most of them for their own interest, not at all for the Eritrean people's interest, those few remaining in the country. And exactly that too. There are very few Eritreans left in Eritrea, possibly a bit above 2 million people, with a very low level of skills and education and qualifications to run a modern state in today's world, but military skills. So that is a huge challenge when we look post Isaias. And I think in an ideal world, Ethiopia would carry the weight of transitioning Eritrea to modernity after Isaias, like West Germany did with East Germany after the reunification. And I'm not talking about the reunification of Eritrea to Ethiopia, not at all. I'm talking about friendly assistance to rebuild a broken country and a broken population and a broken political system with people who have an interest and have a knowledge of Eritrean society. And who has a knowledge of Eritrean society? Tigrayans and Afars. So those will be the natural stepping stones to help build, so to say. And I don't know, it might happen, but then it is under a different political dynamic. One thing is if Isaias dies in office by medical or age conditions. Another thing is if he's pushed out by Ethiopia. Those two are two different scenarios on how post-Isaias Eritrea will look like.
Okay. So, in other words, you are telling me that post-Isaias Eritrea's destiny or fate is just to be disintegrated, right?
No, I'm
Most
not
probably.
telling that. I'm not saying that. I say that is a plausible scenario. I really hope it doesn't, but
Yeah,
it is
say not.
really a plausible scenario, which I'm very much afraid of. Yeah.
Okay, okay. If Sundo solidifies into a structured state-level partnership, whose political ideology and governance model do you think would prevail and trigger a domino chain on the other side?
Say that once again. Sorry.
Uh, the question is, if Sundo solidifies into a structured state-level partnership, whose political ideology and governance model do you think would prevail and trigger a domino effect or domino chain on the other side is the question. Yeah.
So you are asking which side of the Ximdo, which oxen will prevail, so to say,
Yeah, yeah.
the Tigrayan or the Eritrean,
I,
in
I'm talking.
defining.
I'm talking about the system, the
Yeah,
ideology, whatsoever.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. In defining the future.
Mhm.
I'm just carrying the
If some,
oxen metaphor, the Ximdo metaphor, a step further. Um,
mhm.
I think that, and that's a good question. As of now, obviously the Eritrean side has the upper hand in the sense that they are sovereign. They have a huge army. They are, Isaias's skills in maneuvering the real politics of Abyssinia is the best ever. Um, he doesn't have a political ideology beyond a territorial based militant nationalism. It is not underpinned. Well, he has the self reliance ideology, obviously, which goes back to more, harks back to some ideas, which links to TPLF's origin ideologically too, Albanian Hoxanism and so on. But the current ideological strength lies in Tigray, in TPLF, in my view. The ideological strength of Isaias is and the party PFDJ is not there, so to say, because it is no party. It's just a handful of geriatrics. Yeah. So, uh, but TPLF doesn't have the economic resources or the sovereignty issue. So I think that will be a phased model, so to say, that it starts with Eritrea side defining the way forward, but gradually the Tigrayan side will take over or be more determining on that process. Also, if all hinges upon the fact that Ximdo is a successful alliance in not only in the short term but in the medium term, because of the demographic weight of Tigray versus Eritrea, and the skills and the capacities of Tigrayan community versus Eritrean community when it comes to education, experiences, and so on and so forth, which you overwhelm Eritrea. So I think it will be, in that scenario, as long as Isaias is around, he will keep the upper hand because he has the coercive means to do that. But when he is gone, immediately the Tigrayan side will at least try to claim the upper hand and guide the process forward according to their interests and views. And that again is a threat to Eritrean nationalism and identity, obviously, going back to Greater Tigray thesis and all that. So a possible post-Isaias alliance and a possible reconfiguration of statehood between Eritrea and Tigray will not be a smooth process, not at all. I'm not saying that. It will be a contested process, it will be a forced process, it will be a violent process, if it materializes. I'm not saying it will be, but if if the trajectories, if the trends we see today are to unfold in that direction we see they are starting today, you might entertain that idea.
So simply, it depends on two critical criteria or preconditions, right? Yeah. Okay. Let's now proceed to short questions concerning Abiy and the current dynamics involving TDF, Ola, Fano. Simply two questions. Given the growing autonomy of Ola in Oromia, TDF in Tigray, and Fano in Amhara, to what extent does Abiy's daily message of unstoppable prosperity and unity aligning with reality? Could pursuing aggressive strategies like reclaiming Assad without consolidating internal control further jeopardize Ethiopia's stability? This is the first question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's at times difficult to reconcile political statements with empirical reality in Ethiopia and elsewhere for that matter. But it seems to be a widening gap somehow when it comes to the Ethiopian terrain. When you see, for instance, then the very recently released report from the World Bank, which indicates that the poverty level in Ethiopia has risen to 43%, from 33% in 2016. At the tail end of the EPRDF period, it was at 33%. Now it has risen to 43% under Prosperity Party, which doesn't indicate prosperity to the masses, so to say, when more or less close to half of the population live in dire poverty. So I'll just use that data to answer the first part of your question, so to say. It's difficult somehow to reconcile what is said and what is done. When it comes to threats on the federal government by OLA, by Fano, by possibly Tigrayan forces, well, we do see that at least the Fano insurgency, and particularly over the last couple of months in Wollo in particular, apparently is advancing, is at least maintaining a high level of capacity to confront federal forces and possibly also to win local battles. And again, referring to Ethiopian government's institution, the Ethiopian Commission of Human Rights recently released a report which clearly states that it is high level of insecurity across the country, which restricts the freedom of movement of Ethiopians between cities in Ethiopia, between regional states in Ethiopia, because of lack of territorial control and lack of monopoly of violence by the state and official public security forces. There are insurgencies, there are kidnapping, extortion, you name it, across the country, which in one view has, and this is again the official report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, it's not my own data. They have conducted a rather extensive research on that over the last 3-4 months, which indicates that Ethiopia is turning back to a situation which we saw during the 1980s, during the Derg, is a kind of a garrison state, that you have to, that the federal authorities or the central government controls the capital and the major towns, and you have to fly in and not risk to drive between towns and cities in the country. So, but then again, you know, so clearly the insurgencies in Ethiopia, the insurgent groups, are posing a threat to local government and to local level control, having the consequence that there are, what was it 2 or 3 or 4 million school children in Amhara is not attending schools because of the security issues. And you have a disconnect of public services to the local people across the country in many areas. But again, keep in mind that Ethiopia, this is, to be a bit cynical and to have a more historical longue durée view, this situation is nothing new in Ethiopia. You have operated on this for generations, that the center might be stable, the palace might be administered stable, while the country is in rather chaos, in conflict. So as long as the insurgencies doesn't threaten Addis, well, the government is functioning. Yeah? There's no worries, my friend. There is prosperity because we have Addis and we have the regional cities. And that's historical Ethiopia. During long periods of time, this has happened. If we do see, and I think that is the concern of Addis Ababa and the interest of Isaias, is to try to forge an alliance between Tigray, Fano, and possibly OLA elements. And if that happens with Eritrea, you have a very strong alliance, military capacity or demographic recruitment capacity to threaten the center. But I don't see that them individually can threaten the center. Neither Asmara, nor Mekele, nor Fano, nor OLA. But joining together, they might have the capacity. I don't say they will, but they might have the capacity to threaten the center. So that is. So it is very interesting to follow then Ximdo in Tigray, but also talks between, as accused by the federal government, that there are talks and collaboration between Tigray and Fano forces. General Migbe has been accused of being instrumental in some of the offensives in Wollo, for instance.
Yeah, allegations, yeah.
Yeah, allegations, yeah, accusations. We don't know. I don't know. I'm saying the accusations are there. And as a good friend recently told me, that it is a bit surprising to see how well organized, how well equipped, how well uniformed the Wollo Fano has become. So there are outside assistance somehow. Where it comes from, I don't know. So I think, and then you say, you asked also, has the federal government the capacity then to tackle Eritrea while the insurgency are brewing at home? That is,
yeah, especially with regard to the claim to regain Assab.
Yeah, but that can work both ways, as Ethiopia also know, that I remember vividly in 1998, when everybody talked about how weak and fragmented Ethiopia was under the new ethnic federal system by TPLF, and Meles, had these speeches where he kind of belittled Ethiopian nationalism and claimed that it was only 100 years history of Ethiopia, and that the Ethiopian flag was just a piece of cloth, and what's not. And people talked about Ethiopia disintegrating, and then the war broke out, and then suddenly Ethiopia was together, standing as one against Eritrea, and nationalism flourished to a level not seen for a long time, and to a level which almost toppled EPRDF in 2005 election. The nationalistic spirit, so to say, then funneled through CUD in the election in 2005. So I think that is maybe something which is part of the equation when it comes to the power holders in Addis. If if it comes to a war with Eritrea, that will trigger Ethiopian nationalism again. And certainly by some of the Amhara nationalists who claim that Assab is part of Greater Ethiopia or even whole Eritrea. So they will be put in a bit of a squeeze if they're going to fight Addis when the objective of Addis is to reclaim the Red Sea, which they also want, which is a bit of a dilemma. And again, as we saw in the 1998-2000 war, I remember being in Haidia during the 2000 election and all the havoc which EPRDF imposed on the Haidia people, killing candidates and so on, trying to contain Dr. Bene Petros's party, which was the most popular party in Haidia at that time. And I spoke to the local people in Haidia, and they said, you are so deeply criticizing EPRDF government, and you're running against them in election and calling them all kind of terrible names, but at the same time you are rallying behind the Ethiopian government in the war on Eritrea. This was just, the elections was just more or less overlapping with Operation Sunset, the last offensive in the 2000s. And I was said, that was clear, we very obvious answer back from the people of Haidia that we managed to keep two things in our mind at the same time. We are Ethiopian nationalists defending Ethiopia, the motherland, but we hate the guys in Addis. We hate the government. We can fight both at the same time, both Eritrea and the government. So that can also kind of happen if a new war breaks out, that you have the Ethiopian nationalism coming back to fight Eritrea, but at the same time rejecting the authority in Addis Ababa. It is possible to have two thoughts in your mind at the same time. So, yeah, it is a balancing act the federal government has to have if they choose to continue along the path of what is indicated in the letter from the foreign minister to the UN Secretary General. But I think yeah. Let me stop there.
Okay, but do you think there may be such possibility from Ethiopian nationalists, just like the previous already you mentioned, taking all the realities on the ground right now?
That it is a possibility of what?
Of, for instance, the Haidia people already had told you they hate the people in Addis, but they are Ethiopian nationalists, so they won't at the same time fight against any enemy which is against Ethiopia, right? So, do you think there would be such a possibility right now from Ethiopian nationalists?
Oh yeah, I think Ethiopians will defend their country if it comes to war with Eritrea. Certainly, I do think so. Not defending the Prosperity Party, but defending Ethiopia. Maybe not all, but you have 125 million, 130 millions. So at least even if just a quarter of that stands behind Ethiopian nationalism, Eritrea is overwhelmed in terms of recruits and so on. So yes, I do think so, but I also strongly believe that Ethiopian people at large, the Tigrayan people and the Eritrean people, all are war fatigued, all are tired of conflict and war, desperately tired of conflict and war. All people on the ground want peace and stability. They want to be left alone with their families, to protect their children, to get the children to school and to, plow the fields. That's what they want. But I also know that throughout Ethiopian history, the voice of the commoners have little weight when it comes to warring, because the war are decided by political elite, as it has always been done. So that is the tragedy. Yeah, it is not voted upon if you're going to go to war or not. It is decided by a handful of men at the top of society.
Thank you, Professor. The last question: how does Ethiopia's internal fragmentation affect stability across the Horn of Africa?
Well, I don't see so much stability across the Horn of Africa. If you look at Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is still very strong and advancing, where you look on South Sudan in a coup collapse, where you look at Sudan in an open civil war ravaging the country, with the biggest humanitarian disaster in the world today happening next door to you, and when you look on Eritrea as the most totalitarian state on the continent. So it's not so much stability to protect in the Horn of Africa, to use that term, but the situation
Maybe,
sorry, let me
maybe. Okay.
yeah, but the situation which was considering, when the international community considered Ethiopia as a so-called anchor state, that Ethiopia used to have the capacity and capability to project power, to project stability on the Horn of Africa through direct means of peace operations, so-called, but also political, economic stature to project stability. That was, during a period of EPRDF rule, the situation. That is not the situation today. Ethiopia doesn't have the capacity to project stability. It doesn't have the capacity to project stability within its own borders even. So in that regard, it is a very negative detrimental effect on the wider Horn of Africa, that Ethiopia itself has become so incapacitated to project stability. And if that internal situation in Ethiopia is sustained, I don't see so much prospects for the broader Horn of Africa to stabilize. Because one thing is also sure, that the Horn of Africa is best analyzed through what it's called security complex theory, that one conflict interlinks with another across borders. So as long as the instability prevails in Ethiopia, it will most likely also prevail in the neighboring countries, and vice versa. And that's the problem, that political momentum of stability, which were under EPRDF, coerced stability. Sure, it was not open democratic stability, it was a coerced stability, but it was stability, which we can see reflected in economic growth, in social welfare, in health, in educational indicators, and so on. That is no longer seen, and you have a negative impact both domestically and regionally because of that situation.
Okay, these were the questions that I had for today. So before we bring the interview to a close, would you like to share any final remarks or message to my audience in general and to the people of Tigray in particular, Professor?
I hope all my predictions and hypotheses which I've stated here today are false, and that it will be a stable and peaceful development in Ethiopia and the Horn. Obviously, that is also my normative interest, and I know the plight of the Ethiopian people, I know the plight of the Tigrayan people, I know the plight of the Eritrean people. I've been working across these two countries for decades, and my heart goes out to all of you. But I have been interviewed by you, Suchet, based on my professional, academic, analytical position, not as a normative activist. That's why I've been very blunt in some of my phrasings, and I excuse if I have offended any of you of that. That has not been my intention. It has been my intention to reflect upon an outsider's viewpoint, what's happening in Ethiopia and the Horn.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor, once again, for your time and for sharing such valuable insights with us. To all our viewers, thank you for watching Arma Media. If you found this conversation informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more thoughtful discussions on peace, justice, and developments across the Horn of Africa. I am Shushay Adana. Thank you for joining us, and see you in our next episode. Thank you once again, Professor. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.